Ladies and gents, I'm Rex and this is History Summarized England by the channel of the Sarcastic production. English history has a reputation for being nigh incomprehensible, what with all the kings, civil wars, succession crimes and staff fights with France, but with the right perspective and a little royal restraint, England can become quite straightforward story. So let's take a look at this slice of Britain and see how it grew into the master of the Isles. Yeah. England, I think, the England we know of today obviously started with the, Duke of Normandy, right? William the Conqueror, yeah. So, most of the people in England has his blood or something like that, 1 out of 3 or something like that. I don't know. I think that's right, yeah. So this is going to be a fun video. I know about how Britain came to be with, obviously, all the Londinium, the city by the Romans, obviously. But after that, it was all chaos. The barbarians took over. From there, when it became, the powerhouse that we knew that, the England was basically, Britain was basically the biggest empire that ever was. And clearly it had lots of resources and power. When it became when was the turning point that it became that kind of powerhouse? I really want to know that. So I guess, Blue's gonna go into detail about that, I hope. So yeah, it's gonna be a fun video. I would require a few Holy Sarcastic production videos already. If you haven't seen them, check out the cards as a playlist I for it. Holy Sarcastic production reaction. I upload lots of videos in 24 hours, so you might have missed some of them. Check that out. Check out the playlist too, like History, Internet Historian, CGP Grey, Tears Zoo. And yeah, let's do this one.
Names are hard, especially when it comes to the British Isles. The island of Britain is home to England, Scotland, and Wales, while the island of Ireland is composed of the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom's Northern Ireland. This is not only a nightmare to keep track of, but as we've seen, this is all subject to change, probably a little sooner than we think. I say all this to clarify what we're actually going to be talking about in this video. England. Now, not only is England not Britain, but its history is plenty interesting all its own. So, to see how England grew from a simple Roman
England's part of Britain, yeah.
province to the master of Britain and a major world power, let's do some history. Our earliest documentation for England comes with the arrival of Julius Cheekbones Caesar, who crossed over from Gaul in 55 BC. The native Celts were none too pleased with their new neighbors, so Rome kind of stalled for a century until Emperor Claudius established the province of Britannia.
I thought he just, went back to Rome because he didn't like the weather and all the rainy season. Are you saying Doherty was being biased there?
Roman influence on the island was rather slim outside of the main port cities. Since it was hard enough to schlep all those armies across the channel, they were happy to delegate certain responsibilities to the local kings. In 60 AD, one such client king bequeathed half of his lands to Rome, but when the empire glomped all of it anyway, the late king's wife Boudica led a rebellion that burned through several eastern cities, including Londinium, before she was defeated in battle. Later, Romans expanded outwards to the edge of Caledonia before Hadrian said nope and built a wall across the island to stop any hotshot general from getting ideas. The benefit of Britannia's insulation was that it didn't see much disruption from the carousel of imperial civil wars, but the downside was that Britannia was the first province to be cut loose when the barbarians started rolling up in the 400s. The next several centuries
that is true, right? All the civil wars didn't affect much of Britain, but all the shit started to get serious. All the barbarians started to come when the Attila was coming and everything. They just cut Britain loose, like, okay, we can't even hold our own place here, or our own empire at Rome. How are we going to help Britain? So I guess at that time they cut that loose.
Are marked by a constant shuffling between small Romano-Britannic kingdoms and a tidal wave of Northern European newcomers. The polite term for this is disorganized, and the accurate term for this is gross. The early medieval period saw raids and migrations from Picts, Angles, Jutes, and Saxons, and while the map doesn't stop fidgeting with its borders anytime soon, the players get a little clearer by the late 600s. Here we can see 7 major Anglisk and Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, Kent, East Anglia, Mercia, Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. Those last 3 being East, South, and West Saxony, in case you were wondering why England sexed up so many of its place names. These kingdoms weren't entirely Britannic nor fully Germanic. Just like the Romans, it was a case of gradual integration between lots of small and unique groups of people, sometimes friendly, sometimes stabby. For a dash of literary context, the legendary character of King Arthur is set specifically against the backdrop of these Germanic migrations. Historically speaking, our record gets a little clearer in the Christian monasteries of Northumbria, where the scholar Bede wrote the Ecclesiastical History of England, our best source for this period. And monasteries all across Northumbria were becoming magnificent palaces of literature and art throughout the 600s and 700s. Northumbria can have a little bit of a golden age, as a treat. The good news is that this was really shiny, but the bad news is that maybe this was a little bit too shiny, as the glittering attracted our old pals the Vikings, who rolled up to the island monastery of Lindisfarne to save the priceless relics from the totally unrelated fires that started burning right as the Vikings arrived. Weird. From there, the Vikings kept on coming, raiding all—
Oh, they're having a golden age? Alright, I guess it's our time to roll up there, and Vikings just arrived there.
All up and down the coasts and even heading inland with the Great Heathen Army. This was especially bad news for the King of Wessex, who was partway through conquering Mercia when the Scandinavians glomped their way down the eastern coast. They didn't have the means or the interest to form a single unified state, but the laws of these incoming Danes held sway over a pretty beefy stretch of land. So we call this thingy the Danelaw because when historians aren't creative, they're at least direct. While the Danelaw became a shiny mercantile midpoint between Ireland and Scandinavia, it was soon reverso-glomped by the Kingdom of Wessex. By 927, King Ethelstan had conquered all the way to Northumbria and began to style himself as King of England. So now, finally, we can actually discuss England as a single state.
Oh yeah, so 1927 is where the England was founded, huh?
In the century following, Northumbria played hopscotch between English and Viking rule, and some wacky royal gymnastics resulted in the Scandinavian Canute becoming King of England, Denmark, and Norway for 2 decades. But despite the near-constant tire fire of Scandinavian invasions and an extremely squiggly royal lineage, England had become impressively well-run for the time, as the governing bureaucracy was organized and they knew how taxes worked. Not bad. But, as will become a
That's
running
probably
theme in
what Romans left behind. All the knowledge probably there.
the next few centuries, there's no getting over that pesky question of royal succession. After the death of King Edward in 1066, the crown passed to Harold Godwinson, but 2 other parties wanted that shiny headwear for themselves, namely King Harold Hardrada of Norway and Duke William of Normandy. Hardrada arrived to challenge Godwinson for the title of One True Herald, but was beaten at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. However, Godwinson's luck ran out 1 month later when— And that's
Just
the
like
Norman
that.
conquest in a nutshell. In contrast to the other assorted cases of England being conquered, this one had lasting significance. Firstly, William was set on keeping his hot new kingdom, so he invented this little doohickey called a castle and built them all over England to protect his armies from the odd revolt. Meanwhile, he replaced the English aristocracy with freshly imported Norman barons. Now, the Normans, being from France, were French, so they spoke their native language instead.
Yeah, the Norman, killed lots of people and took the land for their barons, right? I remember hearing about that in some video. Like, basically he just went with all the people with the land and just took it from them. I mean, anybody who put resistance were killed or something like that. That was just effed up, man.
Instead of the local Old English. Over the centuries, these 2 languages smushed into each other to create what we recognize as English, our beautiful disaster of a language. The last significant consequence was that William was still Duke of Normandy, and his supervisor, the King of France, was a little miffed that he went and yoinked himself a kingdom. And this diplomatic hiccup would embroil England and France in a casual 600-year-long rivalry. Now, this is normally the point where English history slavishly trails along the royal family tree through all its twists and turns, but this video is a summary, and I don't care about kings. Royal gymnastics are far too dull to be this needlessly confusing. I say this now so we can skip the faff later on. What matters to us here in the mid 1100s is that the royal family married across the channel, so now the King of England became the Duke of Normandy, the Count of Anjou, and the Duke of Aquitaine. England has never been taller. This Angevin period rewrites Anglo-Frankish relations to the tune of "you got chocolate in my peanut butter." Anywho, with this absurdly large tax base and access to half of France load of natural resources up and down the Atlantic coast, the Angevin Empire was an economic powerhouse. Of course, money means rich people, and rich people means armed robberies, so this period is the main historical setting for the legends of Robin Hood, most closely associated with the reign of the crusading—
So basically, they married their royal family with, French families and basically built this small empire across the, across France and England and created this economic powerhouse. I guess this is where the, money and prosperity starts about the England that we know of. The largest empire the England ever had. This is where it started, I guess.
King Richard the Lionheart at the turn of the 13th century. Speaking of military stuff, England took this opportunity to hop westward and glomp onto the Dublin-y part of Ireland. They tried for more, but they didn't really get much else. Conquest is all well and good, but it's also expensive, and France was itching to get the rest of its France back, so the early 1200s saw Normandy, Anjou, and most of Aquitaine go poof. Meanwhile, the barons were fed up with the monarchy, that makes two of us, so they forced a few kings to sign a contract recognizing that teamwork makes the dream work. As in, the Magna Carta makes kings consult their barons, and this puts us on track to get Parliament a ways down the line. Elsewhere in Britain, King Edward Longshanks conquered the Kingdom of Wales and glomped onto Scotland for a hot second, but they broke free. The problem for England was that Scotland had allied with France, and by the mid-1300s, France was in a century-long win streak. King Edward III was a big fan of the part where England owned half of France, so he went for broke and claimed a right to the French kingship to justify a continental invasion. A bold strategy. It won't work, but it took a century for that to become apparent. From 1337 to 1453,
I love that, I want to invade France, but what excuse should I use? We could just claim the, family ties and basically right to the throne. Fine with me.
England and France were locked in a 100 Years' War. Edward oversaw the first act, where the English poured across the Channel and thrashed the French army at the Battle of Crécy. To explain why, we've got to dig into the real juicy stuff. Economics. Alright, look, I minored in econ. I have to at least pretend like this was worth something, okay? It all comes down to how they collected taxes. England had the sophistication to tax money and put it towards a professional army, while France took payment in goods and conscriptions, so their army was bigger, sure, but far weaker. England's advance would have pressed on were it not for the surprise guest appearance of plague. Soon after the fighting resumed, the new French king, Charles V, had a much better time than his predecessor and pushed the English out to the edges of Gascony and Calais. The third phase of the war is the spicy stuff that shows up in all those Shakespeare plays. We're talking Battle of Agincourt, Henry V, Hella Longbows, take that, Frenchies! After the loss, France fell into a civil war and almost collapsed until Joan Kick-Ass d'Arc arrived to absolutely steamroll the English. King Henry VI had exactly 0 ways to handle this, so England got swept right on out of there. By 1453, all they had left was a tiny little sliver of Calais. Despite the war's overt goal of conquer France, it inadvertently cemented a distinct English identity through language, national heroes, and insular geography. The other major consequence was, big shock, another succession crisis. I've covered the War of the Roses before, and I respect you too much to bore you with this. All that matters is that a king died, and two families spent a century stabbing each other over who would get the crown. Plot twist, both of them. Big ups to Henry VII for marrying the houses of York and Lancaster together to create the Tudor dynasty and resolve that mess for good.
Yeah, there you go. That's that Roman lineage right there, stabbing each other for the throne.
The Tudors managed to accomplish quite a bit in their century-long runtime. The first order of business for King Henry VIII was to formalize the rules for royal succession, presumably because he had to read about the War of the Roses and decided never again. But he also had outside problems, as King Charles of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, coincidentally the same Charlie, was getting a smidge overpowered since he put the Pope under house arrest. Further complicating matters was the little fact that Henry's first wife was also Charles's aunt, and she wasn't bearing any male heirs. Henry deftly solved the 3 problems of Charles, the Pope, and his wife in one move by going diet Protestant and forming his own church.
Yeah.
This new Church of England didn't really lead.
Oh yeah. You think religion's gonna hold me? I'm gonna create my own religion.
That hard into Protestant theology, but the real swerve was that the church answered only to the king. This quasi-reformist compromise wasn't exactly the easiest thing in the world to enforce, but the Tudors made it work. Meanwhile, back in geopolitics land, Henry made a new push into Ireland, and tried, and failed, to bully Scotland into uniting with England. In the second half of the century, Queen Elizabeth I held the fort against an increasingly aggressive Spain, way too hyped on conquistador cash to remember what hubris means. In 1588, Spain hucked an armada at England in the hopes of conquering it, but English cannons and English weather smashed the fleet to bits. When Elizabeth died without an heir, the crown passed to her nearest male relative, who happens to be King James VI of Scotland. So in 1603, James became King of Scotland and England. Everything after the union of the crowns is the Britain plotline, where they glomp all the isles, make an empire, all that rule Britannia jazz. So this is where we'll wrap our history of England. And I'll be fully honest, sagas like this give history a bad rap. At a glance, it's a 1600-year-long nightmare that's stuffed with more more monarchs than anybody should be forced to remember, and it's easy to get bogged down in any one episode or to lose track entirely. But the good news is that just because English historians are sadistically meticulous and blindingly self-obsessed doesn't mean that we have to be. Because if we zoom out a little bit and focus on England as a unit rather than a backdrop for royal gymnastics, the important kings will make sense in context and we avoid getting bogged down in the details. So then we can clearly see the macro plot progression from Roman province through the Heptarchy into the conflicts with France and out towards the formation of Britain. So let English history show why the big picture is often the clearest and also serve as an object lesson in the historiographic benefits of restraint. Thank you.
So basically, Britain came to be, the UK came to be because obviously all the kings married, they're basically cousins, their children to other kings in other kingdoms. So along the line, Scotland's king was somehow relative, so he took the throne, united places. Yeah, that was something. You know what? I like how, Henry VIII is like, you know what? I want to do something. I'm the goddamn king. Screw you Catholics, I don't care about religion, I'm going to create my own. And he just started his own religion, Church of England. That's just something. Alright people, that was History Summarized England. If you like my reaction, don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out the reaction, did this link in the description. Check out the cards, all the different playlists, check out the end cards, and I'll see you next time.